This morning we're going to be in John chapter 13 through 17. You have your Bibles and want to follow along, you can go ahead and do so there. I'm going to be kind of jumping around in some different passages in these four right here. I'll put them up on the screen so it'll be easy for you to follow along with right there. If you are newer to this series, we are actually now in the 6th week of a new discipleship series we've been calling Foundations. And Foundations is a series that is really all about our plan for how to either build or rebuild our lives with Jesus at the center of it all. Maybe you came in today, you got that little handout right there. You can grab those and follow along. You're going to see kind of our where we're going each week with that. And you'll kind of see the outline right there. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about are the different beliefs, specifically 30 different beliefs, practices, and virtues. And you're going to see them outlined right there that are going to help us know God well, do what He calls us to do, and then be who He's called us to be. Essentially, the priorities of a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Christ, as we talked about all throughout August and kind of laid that groundwork right there. These are the priorities of a disciple, that we would know Jesus really, really well, that we would do the things that we see Him do, that He also calls us to do, that we would be like Him in everything. And so we're mapping that out in a very specific way over the course of these next 30 weeks. Another way to think about this series and some of the resources that are going to be developed from here on out, it's a discipleship pathway. That you can either use for yourself as you grow and establish your own foundations with Jesus at the center of your life, or you can use it to pass it on to a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, a child, somebody in your own home, that they can have strong foundations for walking with Jesus over the course of a lifetime. So again, you saw on the screen a little bit earlier, there's a blog that'll help supplement some of these messages as dallasbible.org/foundations right there. You could also type in blog at the back end of that slash, and you'll get to the same place. That'll kind of help supplement some of these places that we're going to today. Right now, we're in part 2 of the 4th practice. Okay, you're going to see that on your handout right there. The 4th practice is growing in community, biblical community. And so last week, Scott was here, talked a lot about the why of community, why you should be in community, challenged us all to be in community. You had an opportunity to sign up, and a lot of people did sign up for being connected in community for the very first time here. This morning, I'm going to continue with that, but more so than the why, I want to talk about the how we do it essentially as Jesus did it. Community, like many of these other practices, prayer, being in the Word of God, it's one of these things, again, that we all know is good. We like it. We like the idea of it. We even like being in a community-oriented church in the middle of our community. We like it, love it, value it, and we realize that it's messy and it's very, very difficult to do, right? What are you supposed to do if you happen to be in a community group, a small gathering of people, like-minded people here, that you don't have a whole lot socially in common with, right? Like what do you do? Like, how do you maintain community? How is that a healthy, vibrant gathering of people over there? Like, what do you do if their political or their social views are different than yours, right? Like what if you get into a group and they have a take on something that's this way and you're going this way, or it's vice versa, or whatever it may be? How do you live in community then? How do you live in community with somebody if they went to the University of Alabama and you're an Aggie? Right? I wasn't here last week for that one, my bad. But how do you do some of these? How do you do community well when radical individualism is our God today? Right? Like, how do we do community when, and it's not just Christians and church people and religious people saying that happens to be the God of our day. Like, this is what sociologists, not church people, are acknowledging is the greatest God of America today. We've talked about it extensively around here many times in the past. 2014, a different angle from it. Ross Douthat is which is a fantastic last name, is a columnist for the New York Times. He writes about this a little bit, but he says this. He says, today, you and I are living in a new and deeper age of individualism than we ever have before. And he goes on and he describes this vision of the future from 2014. And I love reading this and kind of seeing what he was predicting about where we'd be today. See if any of it's true today. But here's what he says. He says, in the future from 2014, there will only be one ism, individualism, and its rule will never end. As for religion, it'll decline. As for marriage, it'll be postponed. As for ideologies, they will be rejected. As for patriotism, it'll be abandoned. As for strangers, they will be distrusted. Only pot, selfies, and Facebook will abide, and the greatest of these will probably be Facebook. You think there's any accuracy there? You evaluate kind of where we may be over the course of the past 7 years? And what we've been saying about it is like it's not just an acknowledgement about where we are in a number of different ways. Like it's actually harmful and it's damaging that we've embraced individualism as our superior God. And again, people are acknowledging this all over the place. 2018, British Prime Minister Theresa May made news when she appointed a loneliness minister in the United Kingdom. Why? Because she's looking around and seeing that nearly 25% of our population is experiencing chronic or destructive loneliness in their own life. And we know that it's not just a British problem too, right? This is American as well. In fact, in the United States, the rates have doubled since the 80s as individualism has increased. Nearly 35% of all Americans report that they are now damagingly lonely in life. Nearly 8% have reported, only 8% report having a conversation with a neighbor over the course of the past year. By the way, this is pre-COVID. This isn't, like this study was around 2018, pre-COVID days. Only 8% have reported that they actually had a conversation with a neighbor recently. 1984, the average American had 3 confidants, trusted friends, people that they talked to, confided in, were honest with. Recently, 25% of the population has said we have zero. Recent interview by Vivek Murthy, former Surgeon General, said, during all of my years caring for patients, the most common pathology that I saw, it was loneliness. It was loneliness. And as I'm saying, it's not neutral in its ways by any stretch of the imagination. One study said that disconnection and loneliness is worse than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Another one said that it can have a greater impact on your lifespan than obesity. It can often lead to anxiety, depression, and possibly even dementia is what they're exploring a little bit more today. And these are just some of the physical implications of this, right? Think about some of the social implications of radical individualism playing out today. David Brooks calls it tribalism. Right? And he says this is what takes place as a result of radical individualism. We go off, we alienate, we become alienated from other people, we isolate, we attach ourselves to ideas, social media, apart from real relationships, and tribalism is what takes place. He says individualism has created more loneliness, loneliness has created more tribalism, which he calls the real evil twin of community. Community is based on mutual love, tribalism is based on mutual hate. Community is about what we are for and who we're for. Tribalism is about who and what we're against. Community is about generosity, honor, and celebration of the other. Tribalism is a zero-sum battle for scarce resources where it's kill or be killed. Church, how do we do community as Jesus did it when it seems like we're living at a time that is so openly antagonistic, whether it's intentional about that or not? Like, how do we do community as Jesus called us to do it? This is where I want to go this morning in John chapter 13 and selected places all the way through 17. Again, you can follow along in the Word. I'll put some of these up here on the screen. It'll be easy to follow along with. If you're not familiar with this setting, this is taking place right before the crucifixion. This is the end of Jesus' life and ministry here on earth. Physically, I'm going to say it like that. Just before the crucifixion, this is just after the Last Supper, before Jesus is betrayed. He's in the upper room having a conversation with the disciples, and he's preparing them for what life is going to look like after he ascends to heaven, and they don't really understand what's about to take place. And so he's already predicted his betrayal by Judas. Peter and the disciples are kind of saying, wait, what are we talking about right here? And so this is essentially Jesus' last speech to the disciples before he moves to the cross. Peter's about to interrupt him here in just a little bit. And at the end of chapter 13, here's what he says. He says this, verse 33. He says, "My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. You'll look for me, but just as I told the Jews, I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. And so a new command I give you, would you love one another? As I've told you, so you must love, or as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." Skip ahead to 15, starting in verse 9. "As the Father has loved me, so I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands, and I remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. And my command is this, that you would love each other as I have loved you. Greater love is no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you to do. I no longer call you servants, verse 15, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You didn't choose me, I chose you, and I appointed you so that you may go and bear fruit, lasting fruit that will last. And that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command, again, that you love each other. And now one more in chapter 17, up in verse 20. This is Jesus praying, not only for his disciples, but for all believers. He says this, my prayer then is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. In other words, he's speaking to you and to me. I'm praying for those who will also believe in me through their message. This is us. These are everybody who's going to come to faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he prays this. He says, let all of them be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one, as we are one, I and them, and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me, and they'll know that you've loved them, even as you have first loved me. It's a pretty powerful last word right there, right? I mean, what Jesus just said right there is that the world, the watching world, will know of the Father's love for them by their ability to love one another and to live together in unity. This is what he's saying. It's missional language that Jesus is using at the end of his life, just before he moves to the cross, and then you've got the resurrection, then you've got the ascension and everything else. But he's using missional language right here to say that the way that the watching world is going to know who I actually am, and that the Father in heaven has a profound and infinite love for them, is by the way the community of believers is going to love one another and continue to live together in unity despite the madness that is happening in the world around them. And so what Jesus is talking about right here is not just, hey, how to have a better life right now and be around people that think like you, act like you, and already like the same things that you do. He's not talking about this. This isn't just about, hey, how to have good friends and things like that. He's talking about a community, a people that are intentional in the ways that they love, that they live together in unity, that is going to work towards the end, that yes, they're going to be bearing fruit. However, the people that are on the outside of that community, they're going to be coming in and they're going to be seeing something that is so dramatically different than anything they've experienced anywhere else in the world. And they're going to be longing for that, and they're going to be witnessing the way that we love one another. And they're going to be like, wow, there's a Father in heaven. There's a God who set all this into existence that loves me in a similar way. They're going to long for that love, and God will be glorified in the end. How? Through our love for one another and ability to live together in unity in times that make no sense to be unified. It's our ability to maintain love even in the middle of disagreement is what he's talking about right here. The ability to resist the outrage that is all too common today. The ability to speak truth with grace. It's a willingness to love people that are not easy to love, where extra grace may be required. It's the ability to treat people as equals, recognizing that God has made every man, woman, and child in the image of God, and hence we are equals. It's the ability to care for people that are often overlooked. It's the ability to weep with those who are weeping right now, whether we understand it or not. And the ability to rejoice with other people that are rejoicing. And what Jesus is saying is that this is going to determine the success of his mission in the world. The reason Jesus came, that every knee would bow, every tongue would confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That they would come into a right relationship with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. That they would understand the love of the Father for them. It is contingent upon our ability to love one another and to live with one another in unity. And so we look at a passage like this, and we've got to ask the question, okay, so how are we doing with this? How are we doing with this? It's a watching world, seeing the way that we love one another and being drawn to the love of the Father because we're representing the love of the Father to our world. Is this happening? Is this the reputation of the church? Is it the reputation of your community as you think of community, which we'll get into a little bit further today? Would anyone be able to look at what we call church community, something like that, and think, yeah, one, unbelievable unity, the definition of love going out into the world today. Truth of the matter is it's complicated, right? Like you ask questions like that and it's complicated because you're going to look around at different pockets and you're going to be like, unbelievable, radical examples of love. Jesus kind of love, grace-oriented, truth-oriented kind of love. And you're going to look at different pockets, you're going to be like, unbelievable. And you're also going to look at different pockets, you're going to be like, yeah, what? And then you're going to see Jesus even, and you're going to be like, okay, Jesus being the definition of love, like the perfect example of love, the very definition of love, and people still wanted him dead, right? And you're going, okay, what do we do with that one? Like people wanted a perfect expression of love, crucified, dead, and buried, hanging on a cross. That's how they reacted to it. In other words, like, like sometimes even the greatest acts of love are going to be rejected. Nevertheless, who can deny that the way Jesus loved people was absolutely intoxicating? Like we know that it's sometimes going to be rejected, yet when we look at the life of Christ, the way that he loved people, like who can deny that the way that he did that, the way that it played out, is absolutely intoxifying? Can you imagine being one of the recipients as we see it play out in the Gospels of Jesus Christ? Like, can you imagine being one of the recipients of these radical examples of love? Imagine John chapter 8, for example, this woman who's caught in adultery, and you remember what takes place. The mob brings her out. And she's not alone in that. Like the nature of adultery is that you're not by yourself, right? There's another partner there, yet they're only bringing her out there. And what do they want to do with her? Like they want to stone her and kill her as a result of what she's done. Can you imagine being on the opposite end, being this woman caught in the middle of this angry mob, meeting Jesus? They're sitting there saying, hey, we want her put to death. That's what the law says is right to do. What do you say, Jesus? And Jesus gets down on the ground and he starts writing it out in the sand. He says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then watching as people just dissipate and walk away. And being left alone there with Jesus, and Jesus looking at you in the eyes and saying, is there no one else here to condemn you? Then neither do I. Go and sin no more. Church, put yourself in some of these stories right here. Yeah, can you imagine being that woman in the depth of your shame, caught, whatever that may have looked like, and being met with radical grace, mercy, and love by Jesus, whom all the crowds are following and acknowledging as the Savior of the world, the Messiah, not everyone at that point in time, of course, but can you imagine being the recipient of that kind of love? Being one of the sinners and the tax collectors invited to eat with Jesus in Matthew's house. Can you imagine that? Being the despised of the day. These are the people that are labeled. Like those labels were very prominent and strong back in that day, and Jesus being like, come, let's have a meal together. Like, I want to share food with you, and I want to know who you are. Can you imagine how it talked? It's why the crowds followed him everywhere. They were drawn in, and just what is this kind of love that we're seeing from Jesus? Imagine this, being a leper, right? You've got a disease, no one wants to touch you, be around you, you're cast off on the outskirts of society. And Jesus not only comes and gives you value, but he actually comes and he touches you. And he brings healing to you. Do you think that you would be drawn to this Jesus? That you might have an understanding of love from the Father that you may not have ever had before because it's so unusual in the world in which we live in today? This is the way that Jesus is telling us to live together in community. He simply says this: Christians, believers, church, love one another. Live together in unity as one. Alan Hirsch calls it communitas, and I love this. He says, it is community on mission. It's not just a gathering of people at the same place and time. There are communities all over the place. You don't have to be a believer to be in community. You can be a runner, and you're in running communities. People wake up early in the morning just to run. Who does that? I don't understand clearly, but people do that. There's whole communities built around it, right? And he says this is what biblical community is. It's community on mission. It is a gathering, a smaller gathering of diverse community of believers who intentionally choose to love and to live as one, that they might all bear fruit, that a watching world may also know the love of God for them. And so what Jesus is talking about right here, we have to understand, it's very different than what we experience and how we think about community today. Number one, what Jesus is saying right here is that we love one another before we might even like each other. And this is different than how we think about community today, right? Infinity groups. I need people that are like me. In my particular life stage, which there's value to that. Don't misunderstand me here. But it's different than how we think about community today. I'm not only human, I'm this kind, and 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 I've got this amount of room for my community. Today, what Jesus is saying right here is that we love one another before we might even like each other. I love the way John Mark Comer talks about this. He says, we prefer chemistry over real community as Jesus defines community. Chemistry being that spark that goes off in our affections when we immediately connect with somebody that we like. It could be like a friendship and stuff, and you're like, for me, it was Sean. Sean was my boy. Like high school, we were best friends pretty much immediately. You know, you go hang out with that person, and you're like, okay, we both played baseball. We like the same teams. We had the same sense of humor. We laughed at the same jokes. We liked the same movies, and immediately we became like best friends pretty quickly. And so that's chemistry, and we prefer that all the time. Problem with Sean is that he's a missionary living in Africa right now, and I don't get to physically see him except for probably once every 5 to 7 years, and we try to keep in touch with each other. Nevertheless, we don't get to live in community, proximity around each other, in a diverse community gathering of people physically around each other. We don't get to be able to do that kind of life. And so I would say Sean is my best friend. However, we're not necessarily living together in community. What Jesus is saying right here is that you and I can be a part of an incredible, life-giving community with all kinds of people that you wouldn't have otherwise have anything in common with. It's different than friendship. Like you can have this life-giving community with all kinds of people you have nothing else in common with except for Jesus. This is why he commands us to love one another repeatedly. You heard the repetition. I mean, it was over and over and over. We get it, Jesus. You want us to love each other. He just repeats it over and over again without qualification, right? He's not saying, okay, as long as you're healthy and don't have leprosy, I'll love you. As long as you've got your eyesight and you're not blind, I'm going to love you. And as long as you're not lame, I'm going to love you. No. Jesus loved without qualification. It's by grace that we are saved through faith, that not of ourselves. In other words, it's not by anything that we've done to earn his love, to get his love. It is by grace. It is unmerited, undeserved love given to us through faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is a gift that is received by you and me. This is the way that he loves. And we see this in the way that it plays out in his immediate community too, don't we? Scott talked about this last week, how the community of people that he called to follow Jesus, the disciples, this interwoven group of 12, right? These inner disciples, nothing about that group makes any kind of sense. If you remember this last week, you got Simon the Zealot. And zealot isn't a term of affection, by the way. It's not saying, hey, Simon was just a real passionate guy. Like the zealots were mean. They were hateful. Like they did violence against Romans. They thought that they were ushering in the kingdom of God by eliminating the enemy, the Romans. And so they had anger, they had vitriol. Like they would violently and physically go against the Romans. They would kill people. I don't know if Simon ever did this or anything like that, but this is Simon the Zealot. And he's called into fellowship and community with Matthew, the tax collector, who's a Jew working for the enemy Romans to go in to further oppress Jews, to steal money from them. Like he's a massive traitor. Can you imagine what that fellowship was like? You got Simon the Zealot wanting to kill Romans. You got Matthew the Jew working for the Romans to betray the Jews. Like, what's breakfast like? They come together, like, Jesus is off, he's having his quiet time and everything like that. They're like, yeah, it's one of those awkward scenes. You're like, what's up, traitor? Well, not much murder. You kill anybody this morning? Like, what is that banter like? I mean, it seems a little bit like Jesus might even value the diversity of the body of Christ. That he might even value our different backgrounds and our different ethnicities and our different personalities and our different stories and our different ages and stages of life, the different wisdom that we can bring. I mean, you've got Peter, who's passionate. He's full of zeal, he's real passion, true passion, not a zealot. But you've got Peter, who's that guy that's going to jump out on water and be like, yeah, I'm going to go walk on water. And then you've got John, who's a little bit more the sensitive kind. He's self-describes as the one Jesus loved. This is how he writes about himself in his own gospel. Right? How do we do that? You got Mary Magdalene, a follower of Jesus. And she's a woman that's got a lot of baggage as one who is possessed by 7 different demons, before she came to follow Jesus. Like, that's a woman that's got a past. And then you've got Andrew, who seemingly had faith in God since the time he was born. Like, this is his community right here. Like, this is who he's calling us to be in fellowship with and to have community with. Now, church, you ever been surprised by a relationship before? I mean, honestly, you ever been surprised by a connection that was made you never thought would ever take place, ever? A little while ago, I was talking with a guy, probably mid-70s, and he's telling me about how life-giving this new relationship has been with this 30-year-old kid, he calls him, in his community group. And I love that he calls him a kid, and so he's like, Aaron, you wouldn't believe it. This is amazing, the kind of relationship that we have together. And before you start thinking it's one-sided, I talk with the other guy, and he's like, yeah, Aaron, this is unbelievable. I never thought we would have had this kind of connection before. The older guy starts talking about the amount of joy and passion that the younger guy's bringing into this relationship. The younger guy's sitting there going like, yeah, who would have thought? Like, he's got wisdom. He's actually been through marriage before, can speak in, like, shocker, right? There's value in the different things that we bring together in the middle of this in the middle of this community that has the mission of God in mind, has this common bond in Jesus Christ together. And Jesus just brings together these very, very different people. I'm thinking of very personal, specific people in my community today that I can honestly say I love and enjoy. And I never would have been able to connect with them if we did not love before we liked each other, if we did not choose to love one another and pray with one another and bear each other's burdens in the context of this community and walk with each other and care about each other long before we ever knew if we ever liked each other first. It's just different. It's not chemistry that Jesus is talking about right here. Likability. Do you connect on every single level? Is it the perfect community or anything like that? He's talking about loving one another before we even like each other. He keeps going and he talks about, it's not about the number of connections that we have. This is a very different kind of community than we think about community today. It's not quantity of connections, it's about the quality of your connections, right? We think about our community today is how many friends that we have on Facebook, how many likes that we get, how many followers that we have, how many different connections we could possibly make, and we got like thousands and all across the spectrum and things of that nature. And he's just simply talking about the quality of those connections more so than the quantity. Which is really, really great news because every single article and study that's coming out today is saying that we are more connected than we've ever been before because of internet, because of social media, because of highways, because of ease of travel. We're able to get together. We're able to connect in ways that we've never been before, but we are also more disconnected. We are also more despairing. We are more depressed. We are more anxious. We are more lonely than we've ever been before. Why? Because the quantity of our connections will never be able to replace the quality. It'll never be able to replace the quality. Same study from 2010, it says the number of confidants that we have has dramatically decreased over the past 25 years. 1985, only 10% of Americans have said that they had one person that they can discuss important matters with. Only 15% said that they had one good friend, 1985. By 2004, those numbers are 25%. They said that they have nobody in their life that they could talk to. Not one real friend that I could be honest and vulnerable with, that would carry my burdens, that would walk with me, that I could be really vulnerable and really honest with. Only 20%. And this is 2004, church. Like, that's a whole teenager away, 16, 17 years ago, right? You think things have changed in the past 16, 17 years? And they're saying that marriage is not the cure-all either. Like, we think, hey, I'm going to get married and never going to be lonely again. They're saying that people who are married are less lonely than single people, but here it is. It's only if their spouses are confidants. In other words, it's only if they've done marriage in such a way that there's trust, there's honesty, there's vulnerability, they're confidants. You do life together. You bear one another's burdens. You rejoice. You celebrate. You mourn. You partner together under a common direction and a common purpose. In other words, like, even in marriage, like, there's a way to do relationship where people may know my name, but not actually know me. There's a way to be home, but not really be home. There's a way to parent, and you know my title, you know my role, but you don't actually know me. A little while ago, last year, we talked about Tim Uhoff's The Pyramid of Communication is what we called it. You guys remember this? I don't know why shapes seem to communicate really, really well, but they do for some reason. But I love this. This is about a year ago. We talked about this, the pyramid of communication, but he's talking about how there are 5 layers of depth to a very meaningful connection with another human being. And he says you've got to get all the way to the end in order to establish that meaningful connection that's actually to go anywhere and have any kind of substance and depth to it. So he talks about this pyramid of communication, the different layers. Number 1 is cliche, the most shallow at the very top of the pyramid. It's the, hey, how you doing? Oh, great. Things are going great. And it's cliche. Everybody engages in those. There's no depth or substance to them. Number 2 is facts. It's the, hey, did you see the game? What happened in the game yesterday or something like that? Well, the facts are the Gators lost again to LSU. Now Ryan Turner is going to be all over me this next week. And so, those are the facts of what happened yesterday. The facts are, anyway, I won't go there. Number 3 is opinion. It's what did you think about the facts, right? And it's going a little bit further there. It's what did you think about the facts? Well, I think we need to do a defensive coordinator right now, right? And you've got all these opinions about kind of what's going on. What are you thinking about what's happening culturally? What do you think about what's going on in schools? What do you think about what's going on in homes and in parents and in youth and in adults and in the church? And what do you think about those things? Number 4 is the emotive. It's the emotion. It's getting into a little bit more depth right there. It's the deeper levels of communication. It's okay. It's not only what do you think about it, but it's okay, what do you feel about what's taking place? You're seeing all these things go on. What are you feeling about what you're seeing actually take place? And then number 5 is transparency. Who are you actually in light of what's going on? What's true about who you really are? Are you able to be real about who you are? And Uhoff goes on and he says, all the greatness of human interaction and relationship, things like engaging intimately with another human being, be it friendship, be it romance, right? All the greatness of human relationship, things that are going to bring about change, being able to reconcile with another person that you've broken relationship with, it all requires that we move to number 4 and to number 5. However, normalcy teaches us to hang out in number 1 to 3. And this is the tension. It's not normal. What Jesus is calling us into, it is not a normal community. You think about even how it plays out a lot of times at church and how we play out on a weekly basis on Sunday morning. We can come in and you may or may not be able to slip in a back row or to a chair, and maybe somebody asks and says, hey, how's it going? And you're like, oh, blessed, because that's what we say at church, right? Everything's blessed. That's what you're supposed to say. Yeah, you can't be real. You can't say, you know what? It's tough right now. Think about it. You go to an adult Bible fellowship, and it's a classroom, and you're learning a lot of great things. You're taking furious notes all about it, and you're sitting in the back of a church, and all the while, no one knows that your world is falling apart, and you're desperate for God to work in your life. What Jesus is talking about here is unbelievably different than how it's practiced a lot of times today. You think about, you can come in and you can go through all the rhythms of church, and you can do even a little bit of marginal relationship and community, and all the while, they have no idea about the miscarriage from a past month, the pain that we're experiencing, the tears that took place Monday through Saturday. They have no idea that your marriage is barely hanging on and that you can't stand the person you committed your life to. Why? Because there's a preferred way of doing relationships where people can know my name, they just can't really know me. And it happens all the time. We settle for it, and we live in it, and it's normal. Uhoff says that this is the world in which we live typically, and apart from intentionality and choosing to go further or something miraculous taking place, we hang out in number 1 to 3 all the time, and we never move into the joys of community. I think there's a few different reasons for this. Number 1 is FOMO, fear of missing out, right? This is one of the things that keeps us from engaging in genuine, true, biblical, Jesus-oriented, God-glorifying, people watching our love for one another kind of a community. It's a fear of missing out. It's a desire to not commit because there may be something greater coming a little bit later on. Mark Edmondson is a professor at University of Virginia. He talks a lot about people today being possibility junkies. He writes a lot about this, but he says this is who we are. We're possibility junkies. And so it keeps us from being able to engage in real community or being able to commit to anybody in a very meaningful and deep, real way. He says he sees this in his students, and he says for as much as they want to do with their life, They simply won't commit to anything. Socially, if it's 5:30 on a Friday night, you ask them what they're going to be doing that night, they're going to be like, I have no idea. Meanwhile, they're going to have like an entire buffet of options and parties and social events that they could go to on a Friday night, right? When it comes to academics, students today want a blog version of world literature because no one wants to commit the time to a work that they might not actually enjoy. When it comes to relationships, we choose the hookup rather than the commitment. And then he says, it's like we've forgotten that all great things, marriages, relationships, friendships, academics, work success, it all requires a commitment to be great. Think about it, like everything that we admire, everything we long for, even a church, a community of believers we want to be a part of, we want to tell our friends about, like it requires a commitment for that thing to be great. And what Jesus is saying right here is go there and community, commit to one another, love one another. He says, what greater love is there than a person who's willing to lay down his life for a friend? The epitome of commitment. Like my life, like there's nothing off the table. I'm laying it down for your good. What greater love is there than a person who's willing to lay down his life for his friend? In other words, what he's saying is love is commitment. And we know that. But we still don't always go there because there's something greater that could be coming along a little bit later. And so what Jesus is saying, no, he's like, this is the greater. This is the greater. What I'm going to accomplish in a genuine Jesus-oriented, Christ-like, God-glorifying, loving one another sort of a community, that is the greater. So here's what you need to do. We need to love one another and live together as one. Idealism is a thing that gets in the way of genuine community, number 2. Idealism is a thing that gets in the way of genuine community. And I say this as one who is very idealistic in nature. I do this we're talking about expectations and idealism right now, right? We're talking about communities that love one another and that live together as one. This is ideal, right? And we understand that idealism, Bonhoeffer talks about this, but he says that it gets in the way of genuine, real community. We had a fascinating conversation about this earlier this week with some of the different ministers on staff. But he says this in his book, Life Together. And Bonhoeffer says, those who love their dream of Christian community more than they love the Christian community itself, they become destroyers of that Christian community, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. I want you to hear this. I'm going to say that again because Bonhoeffer language can go right over our heads a lot of times. And again, this is a visionary, somebody who thinks 20, 30 years down the road. I mean, we're calling each other to Christ-likeness and to expectations and to all kinds of ideals right here. Those who love their dream of a Christian community more than they love the Christian community itself, they end up becoming destroyers of that Christian community, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. He says, God hates this wishful dreaming because it makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. Those who dream of this idolized, perfect community where like, hey, everybody's mature already. The people that sit there and be like, hey, like my community, my church, like how dare there be hypocrites in there? Like how dare someone continue to sin? This idealized version of, hey, how dare anybody have a struggle or feel the weight of pain in the world today? How dare someone not just be blissfully unaware of what's going on around you? Like how dare, like anybody with this kind of expectation, he says, they demand that it be fulfilled by God and by others and by themselves. They enter the community of believers with demands set up by their own law, and then they judge one another and God accordingly. And then they end up walking away because it never aligned with their ideals. Anyone seen this, seen this play out in the world today? The church, it's got bad people in there. Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, check for cards, right? Not everybody's consistent. Well, that person is a Christ follower, and they're not. Tim Keller writes about this in his book, Meaning of Marriage. Fantastic marriage book if you're looking for something right there. But he says the number one reason marriages fail is because of wildly unrealistic expectations. He says we get into it expecting somebody else to come and to complete us, instead of coming into it figuring out that this is somebody I'm called to love. Man, are we seeing this play out? People avoid marriage for 5, 10 years or walk away from it altogether. Or maybe we bounce from church to church or group to group to group because these people, they're not really my people. I don't know. And it's tough because, again, like we said, there's always expectations. Jesus is talking about ideals. He's calling us to a radical view of love. We hope for this kind of love, but we've also got to understand and we've got to expect that community and life together, it's going to be messy, right? Isn't this one of the expectations that we've got to have? It's going to be messy. Like humanity is messy. Relationships are messy. People are messy. Why? Because we are messy. We aren't Christ yet. We aren't Christ-like yet. He is coming back again. He's going to make all things brand new. There will be a day with no more sin, no more sadness, no more suffering, no more pain. We aren't there yet. You and I, in as much as we are following Jesus, are growing into his likeness every single day. Nevertheless, you and I are walking in this place where the ideal is not yet reality. And so we have to expect that our community together, it's going to be really, really messy. I mean, the church is people. People are really messy. Every single morning I wake up and I'm very painfully aware of how broken and how not perfectly Christ-like I am yet. Anybody there? Like anybody actually go through the honest practice of bringing myself before a holy God and realizing he's God, I'm not. He's holy, I'm not. Like I'm painfully aware of like my deficiencies as a leader. Like I don't need the email, all right? It's just like I'm painfully aware of my deficiencies as a leader. Like I know the thoughts that go on in my head. I know the differences between what I want to say sometimes and what actually comes out. I know all my fears and my insecurities. Like I know how much grace I need. And here it is, like I know that every single time that I bring the reality of who I am to the throne of God, to the foot of his grace, and I bring it to Jesus, and I honestly confess these things, and I bring it to him, I know every single time I'm getting grace from him. Not so sure about it when it comes to people. It's the difficulty of community, is it not? Am I going to get grace from you or my community, the people in my life? This past week, I came back home and had an honest conversation with Kat, and I was like, babe, I'm carrying a lot of things. I'm weighty right now, dealing with family drama and difficulty right there. And I was like, there's a difference between what I want to give to my family. I feel emotionally disconnected at different times this past week, and I had this conversation with her, and I was able to have that conversation because I know that in the middle of this relationship that we have, it's safe. I know that I can talk with her, and it's going to be safe. That she's not going anywhere, that she loves me. Like it's profound the amount of vulnerability, honesty, the depth of relationship that can take place when you're in a safe relationship with one another. When you know that there's going to be grace on the other end of this truth that's coming out. And so this gets into the third difficulty, and the reason why we don't often get into real community today is because there's a legitimate fear of being hurt. And this is one of the main things that keeps people from coming and getting to number 4, getting to number 5, in the pyramid of communication, engaging in genuine, real community that is Jesus glorifying, others centered, loving, all the different things, is that there's a genuine and legitimate fear of being hurt. And the reality is, like, some of us know exactly what that fear and know exactly what that pain is. You know the difficulty of opening up and finally choosing to be real, only to be completely ghosted by the people that you trusted. You know what that's like. Like some of you know what it's like to lay it all out there and then to not be believed about what you're saying. To finally come out about like what's really going on at home. Crying out for help. Needing to be embraced. Needing a little compassion, a little kindness. Yes, truth, not abandoning truth by any stretch of the imagination. But you know what it's like to come and bear it all out in the community of people that you know, you love, and you trust, only to be ghosted and abandoned by those people at the same time. Some of you know what it's like to confess and to actually trust God and to say, okay, there's freedom in my confession and getting this out. Here's what's really going on. Here's my struggle. Here's my inner turmoil right here. And then met with condemnation and guilt. How dare you be there? You deal with that? That's not Christ. Some of you know that pain. To come and to trust people. Father, I'm walking out in faith right here, and I'm going to confess my sin, and then to be ghosted and abandoned by the people that we've come to trust. I was preaching a similar thing a number of years ago, and after the message, a lady comes up and she says, all that stuff that you're talking about with vulnerability, honesty, sincerity, confession of sin, bearing one another's pain, she's like, it's wonderful, and it all sounds great, but it assumes that the community of people that you're in relationship with are trustworthy. And she goes on and she tells me this story of finally getting to the point of bearing her soul being real. And they just cut communication. They're done with them. Along the same lines, I'll never forget a number of years back when we first moved to Dallas, we were walking with some people and enjoying them. And, hey, how's your community group going? We know that they were good friends. We know what's going on and how are things going? And the literal response is, oh, no, we're done with them. It's like, what do you mean? Well, we started going to community group, and these people just started talking about like all the difficulties in their marriage, and quite honestly, like we were newly married, and like we just didn't want to hear that. Like it was kind of depressing. And so we're done. We're gone. And what Jesus is saying is that it's just not the way of Christ. It's not the view of community that he's calling us into today, that we would love one another, that we would serve one another, that we would care for one another. Paul says love is patient, love is kind. It doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it doesn't brag about, hey, how great everything is right now, and it doesn't only sit in despair, it's not proud, it doesn't dishonor other people, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love doesn't delight in sin or evil, it's not silent about the truth. We're not talking about just patting everybody's back and be like, oh, great, you're blowing up your life and dishonor. Like, we're not talking about that. It always rejoices in the truth, it always protects, it always trusts. It always hopes, it always perseveres. Love never fails. Church, can you imagine being a part of a community like that? Can you imagine that kind of community? Honestly, I imagine it would be a little bit like an AA meeting. I don't know if you've ever been. You know what they do in an AA meeting? They choose to love one another before they like each other. They choose quality of relationship at that point in time in their life over quantity. They choose to commit to regular meetings, to a sponsor, to honesty and to vulnerability, to sobriety. They embrace the mess, and they choose to live in reality rather than idealism. And they typically begin a meeting by standing up in front of a trusted community of people and saying something to the effect of, hey, my name is Aaron. And I'm an alcoholic. It's been 100 days since my last drink, or something like that. And they get vulnerable and they get real in front of a group of people. And then they rest in the grace that's given by that community. Nobody's screaming at them. Nobody's shocked. Nobody's yelling, you alcoholic, what's wrong with you? Get your life together. No one's doing that. It's just undeserved, unmerited grace. It's them looking at him saying, is there no one left to condemn you? Then neither do I. Go and sin no more. Church, the practice this week is not so much that you would simply go and join a new community. It's that you and I would take some time today, sometime this week, that you do an honest evaluation of the quality of your community, the quality of your ability to love one another honestly, vulnerably, before you decide whether you like them or not. That you would take some time, that you would evaluate, is this a community where a watching world may come in and come to understand the love of a Father that would send his one and only Son to come and to make sinners clean again, to be brought back into right relationship with him? Would our love for one another communicate that message to a watching world? Because what Jesus is saying right here is that the success of his mission, a world longing for that kind of a love that is there, they would come to understand the love of the Father for them through our love for one another and our commitment to live together in unity. That we would take some time this week and that you would evaluate, am I a part of a community like that? Am I a contributor of love in such a community that is going to be that glorifying to the God who created me and put all things into existence. Father, we love you, God. We praise you and we thank you for the grace and for the mercy and for the love that you've given to us in Jesus Christ. And going to the cross, suffering, bleeding, and dying, that our sins would be forgiven, that we would be washed clean, made right, brought into relationship with you. Father, I pray that we who call you Lord, God, that we would be aware of that love all the more, that we would be able to pass it on to friends, to family, to acquaintances, to even enemies, as you talk about all throughout the Gospels, that a watching world would know that they are loved. The extent that you are willing to go to make grace available to them. Father, would you come and would you do that in us? Would we be a place at Dallas Bible Church that reflects you well? Would our love for one another be pure? God, would our grace be enormous? Would it be enormous? And would you soften somebody today that needed to be a little bit more connected with your grace? God, would they receive it in a brand new and in a fresh way from you today? Father, we long that you're praised. We long that you're glorified. We give you all of our lives. We give you all of our hearts, all of our soul, all of our mind and our strength. It's all yours. So come and have your way in us today. Church, I just want to give you a minute, heads bowed, eyes closed. Would you just take a minute of silence and just talk with the Lord, whatever he may be putting on your heart? The band will sing over us, and then we'll be invited to join with them and to sing in just a minute.